All right, this is going to be a long video. I went to the Open at Austin 2024 and I took a lesson with Albert Tam, who can throw over 700 feet. And then I also ran into a couple other pros there, and they threw my tech disc and were testing some things out like nose angle. And so I'll share those stats at the end of this video, but I'm also going to share all the questions that I asked Albert in my lesson and all the answers he gave me. And then the other pros, I didn't directly ask them all these questions, but whenever they suggested something that gives me an idea how they're thinking along the lines of a particular question that I asked Albert, I'll kind of fill in what I think they were doing as well. So before I get into the questions and answers, just to give a little information on taking a lesson from a pro and what my recommendation is for that. So if you want to be helped the most, I'd actually recommend taking a lesson from a coach that has good reviews. The coach generally is going to have more experience teaching and helping you make corrections, and even a better understanding of like the nuanced mechanical aspects of the form, because a lot of pros, they did a lot of hard work for sure, but they also have a natural athletic ability, and so they can use these simple cues and then allow their natural athletic ability to kind of intuitively learn the nuances, and maybe can't explain the nuances as clearly. Now, of course, it's possible for a top pro to also be a top coach, but usually they don't go together very often. And the pros who do a lot of coaching will be used to helping people with all the common issues, so it can still definitely be helpful. All right, so the first question I asked Albert was about grip and how he aligns his power grip. So he does the typical alignment where between these two fingers and then through this middle groove of the palm. And then his thumb placement was a little bit into the flight plate, with a little space between the flight plate and the rim. This was also Jake Hebenheimer. He actually said he feels the rim when he presses his thumb into and deforming the flight plate. He feels the rim kind of on the right side of his thumb. And then Albert Tam, I asked him his back three fingers here. Does he have these last knuckles curled or extended like this? Curled or extended? He has them curled, and I believe I saw Jake Hebenheimer also have them curled. And I plan to do some tests with the tech disc to see if those knuckle positions affect the spin. But I don't think it'll have a huge impact, maybe a small one, so comfort is probably the number one thing there, so I definitely recommend trying both of them. There's a video where Connor O'Reilly talks about putting his thumb kind of halfway between where the rim and the flight plate are, so that's kind of bisecting the middle of the thumb. In terms of grip pressure, I can't remember if I asked Albert this, but Jake Hebenheimer said he's gripping it really hard for hard throws, and he's keeping that grip pressure the whole time during the backswing, everything. Albert, I believe, is using a pretty firm grip pressure. Mason Ford uses a fan grip even while driving, like a modified fan grip, with the two middle fingers fanned out onto the flight plate, and he said he keeps the grip pressure loose initially. Of course, it has to tighten up later on, so that the disc doesn't slip out. And you'll see in the tech disc stats later that he gets pretty good spin. All right, the next couple questions were about footwork. I asked Albert, I showed him a picture, which I'll put on the screen here, where his right foot is more open than you usually see it just before the X step. And I asked him why, if it was intentional. And he said it wasn't really intentional, but sometimes he's just trying to keep an eye on the target for longer, and having it open, makes it easier to keep an eye on the target. But of course, you're going to have to close it on the way into the brace. So I think that's why a lot of people already have it closed, to make sure that they don't accidentally keep it open going into the brace. However, something interesting about this is the more open your right foot is while you're X-stepping, the harder it is for your X-step to turn and point backwards, because it's going in the opposite direction. So that could be a potentially helpful thing to stop turning your X-step backwards, but you then just have to remember that your right foot is open and you need to close it going into the brace. Next, I asked Albert if he tries to match his footwork pace to his throwing power. So if you throw harder, you move your feet faster. If you throw slower, you have a slower, instead of a run up, a walk up. And he said yes, but it's subtle, which is, I can definitely attest to. I watched one of his rounds up close, and it looked like he was going really slow. I couldn't really notice a speed up even when he was throwing harder. But that may just be because most of the throws were well within his comfort zone. Paul Ulibarri is somebody who has this idea that he says, your footwork speed needs to match your throwing speed to be synchronized. Otherwise, you're going to run into problems if you're trying to throw really hard with a really slow walk up, for example. Next, I asked Albert if he thinks about his brace force as being more vertical, like pressing the brace down into the ground, or more horizontal, pressing it against the ground more laterally. And he said he thinks about it more vertically. And then Jake Hebenheimer, it seems like Jake has a more of a vertical mindset to it. Next, I asked Albert, well, what are the primary things he uses to aim his drives? And he said that it's running up in a straight line towards his aim point, initially starting a little bit to the right of the line so that he can kind of step diagonally onto the line and then run up straight, and then planting the brace foot perpendicular to where he's aiming and reaching back in a pretty straight line to the aim point. And then, of course, he also focuses his vision on where he's aiming. So next, I asked about the reach back. I asked Albert if he uses scapular protraction during the reach back. This is where if you hunch your shoulder forward, so like this, forward, retracting the scapula is bringing it back, bringing them forward is like a hunching of the upper back. So during the reach back, does he add scapular protraction? He had to think about this. He hadn't thought about it before. And after doing the motion, he's like, yeah, I think I do, but it just happens naturally. Albert, on the other hand, during the power pocket, said he didn't really feel like he's doing scapular protraction, or at least not a lot. Then I asked Albert if he's ever tried he said he talked about a straight reach back in line with the target, and then I asked him, has he ever tried a wider reach back? Then I asked if he uses his reach back height as the primary way to adjust the launch angle. So for example, if you're gonna throw it up higher, you reach back on that same angle low to pull through high. And he said yes, that's mostly what he thinks about. And I also asked Connor Rock, and Connor said the same thing. So Albert was trying to think, what else he does when he's trying to control his launch angle, and he said, maybe his back leg is a little bit lower, and I think what he was getting at here was if your back leg is bent a little bit more, you're likely to be kind of pitching your shoulders a little bit more up like this. And this is something I just saw in a recent Drew Gibson video. In his episode 1 of Reclaiming the Crown is the title. He talks about this. He throws a shot. He's like, I wanted that to be a little bit lower, so I'm going to try to pitch my shoulders up more. People are probably doing a combination of both. And this is also why, really focusing your eyes on your target is so helpful, because if you're looking up, your body wants to lean to help you look up. So these next questions are about the pull through and the power pocket. So I asked Albert and some of the others if they think more for the power pocket and the pull through along the lines of out, in, out, or reaching straight back and pulling through in a straight line. Albert and Jake and Connor Rock all said that they focus on a straight line pull through and reach back. Next question was, I asked Albert if he's throwing at 90% effort compared to 70% effort, where in his form does he feel the largest difference in effort changing between those shots? And he told me it was in his brace, mostly, that he's trying to put more force into the brace when he's throwing harder. And Jake, I didn't ask him this directly, but he was telling me that he uses that very strong vertical brace force when he's trying to throw harder. So next I asked Albert if he uses side bending in his coiling. So side bending is like this, but when you're doing it during a coil, if I just coil with my torso and then I side bend, it's in this direction. But then there's also, hyzer bending, which is just like this. Albert said he doesn't really think about this. I think it's something that just naturally happens in most pros, but it's more clear. You can more clearly see it in some pros compared to others. So he's not thinking about it, but he's probably doing some of it. So next I asked if how Albert aims when he's throwing softer approach shots, if he is making adjustments to his form. And he said that he likes a slightly more open stance and less coiling, and not extending the elbow as much in the reach back. All right, next I asked about the off arm. I asked Albert if he had tried these different styles where the off arm comes in kind of behind the back, to the side, or across the abdomen before coming down. And he said he hadn't really tried anything other than what he normally does naturally, which is more towards the side. Next I asked about the off arm timing. I asked if Albert tries to bring the off arm in just before starting the pull through or at the same time, and either I forgot what he said or he just gave me a general answer. But from watching footage, it looks like on big drives, a lot of pros are bringing the off arm in just before the reach back is finishing and just before the pull through starts. But they're probably just, it just happens naturally when they're trying to throw harder. Next, I asked about angle control. I asked if he was going to be throwing 2 throws that are the same power and the same amount of hyzer and in the same initial direction, but one of them is going to be like 20 degrees higher launch angle than the other throw. what is he going to change in his form to make that adjustment? And he said it's going to be the reachback height. So this is me asking that same question I asked before, but with a very concrete example to see if the answers match up, and it did. Then I asked if Albert was going to be throwing 2 shots really high into the air, everything the same pretty much, except one of them he wants it to be really nose down, and the other one he wants it to kind of just stall out. What is he going to do to make one of them nose down? And Albert just said he thinks about pouring the tea, and we'll get more into this with the tech disc stats and tests. And then of course just the angle control question about hyzering and anhyzering, and as suspected, he uses body lean for hyzer and more upright for anhyzer. And then I asked him a question from somebody on Disc Golf Course Review, which is a great site. All these questions about form, people there go into a lot more detail. And the first question was, who was the biggest influence on Albert in terms of like studying form? And he said it was Simon. And then, what's a piece of form advice that you tried that did not work? And Albert said it was the forehand power grip, so with the index finger like this and the middle finger out. Albert uses the more traditional 2-finger stacked, or whatever it's called. This other question was about, do you feel more like you're swinging or pulling? I didn't ask Albert this question directly because he already told me that he thinks about pulling in a straight line. And then the last question was, what's a common misunderstanding in disc golf backhand form? And Albert said it was the X step turning backwards. That's something he's seen a lot. And my general recommendation for this is to just try to do a really short X step. It's usually when you do a longer X step that it ends up turning backwards. And having it turn backwards is bad because you want your hips to be starting out facing like this when you're coiling, so that you're coiling against your hips and creating tension. But if your X step turns backwards, my hips are now already facing backwards, so I barely have to coil at all to have my reach back straight back. So there's very little tension, so it's a lot harder to create power. Okay, so now for the tech disc stats, I have for Albert Tam, Mason Ford, and Jake Hebenheimer. And they were experimenting with some things and also throwing into a net. So sometimes it's hard to throw a higher launch angle into a net. So when you see the lower launch angles, those were not launch angles that would be thrown for max distance. So just keep that in mind. And they also weren't necessarily throwing their hardest probably, and they're messing around with certain things. So I asked Albert to throw nose down like he normally does, and then we have the stats there, which he's focusing on pour the tea. Then I asked him if he'd ever tried the turn the key, which is wrist supination, and he hadn't really thought about it or seemed to have heard about it before, so I asked him to try it. And at first, the first throw wasn't a big success. He was like, oh, it feels weird. Understandably, it's hard to change something immediately, but the pros are pretty fast. So I said, try to really exaggerate it and don't throw, max power. And pretty much right away after that, he got more nose down than with his normal pour the tea cue.
So Jake Hebenheimer and Mason Ford also tried turn the key, but only a few times, and it didn't immediately click for them. However, I'm sure they both could have picked it up quickly and used it to easily get -4 nose down or more. But Jake was already getting a lot of nose down with an inverted swoop cue. he multiple times threw -5 nose down. And then Mason Ford was already getting like -2 nose down pretty easily, and sometimes -3 with pour the tea cue. But I suspect people who get more than like -1 nose down with pour the tea have intuitively learned to make additional form changes to get that extra nose down, and those form changes have just um, habitually happen when they think of the pour the tea cue